Uh, I, I'm really touched by the acknowledgement of my volunteerism. That was a very nice thing. I don't think I deserve it, but there are other people in town that have done much more to volunteer. And I think one of the things we'll be talking about tonight is the effect of that kind of volunteerism in the community at large. In my lifetime, I've seen this happen over and over and over again, regardless of how severe the occasion was. The ability of this town to respond to the needs of its community is really quite stunning. And I think the history of that over time is something we should all take heart in as we go forward into the current crisis that we're experiencing. So we do want everybody to contribute things, and because of the difficulty of this medium, we'd like you to raise your hand if you have something to contribute so that we can unmute you and give you a chance to tell your stories. This is not a lecture. This is not something I have any qualifications in giving you any history of other than my own experience in living in town. And that's not going to be enough to entertain you for an hour. So I really hope that you all volunteer. And just to start with, the museum put out a video for Halloween for their cemetery tour. And it was quite interesting to see the actors portraying people who had died during the Spanish influenza back in 1918. And of course, we call it the Spanish influenza, but in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Stephen, it started in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. It has its roots in at one of the army bases here in the United States, and apparently it got the name the Spanish flu because the Spanish government was doing the most reporting on the flu as it spread around the world, and that's how it came to be known as the Spanish flu. So it actually started here in the United States of America.
And we lost how many people?
So with our research that David Babington, one of the Gunn Museum volunteers, was so nice to do for us down at the Bryan Memorial Town Hall, he looked into the death records for the fall of 1918, and it appears that at least 10 Washington residents passed from the flu that year. And it's interesting to see that most of them are young. They were all of them were under the age of 60, which is quite the opposite of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, there was, I mean, obviously the influenza lasted much longer than that. And as we're experiencing now, there were several surges of that influenza. And so there probably were more people who weren't reported as victims directly of the influenza. But at that time, not very much was known, but from some historic images that we've seen, there were a number of situations where you see people wearing masks, quarantining themselves, and trying to figure out how to deal with something which they didn't have the luxury of the scientific expertise that we have now. However, they were very knowledgeable about how to deal with various things. I mean, people had experienced cholera. There was a smallpox breakout in Woodville, I believe, and people were quarantined, and the area was posted for signs saying don't enter the area or don't leave, or however, such and so forth. So there's a long history in humanity of dealing with plagues, and if you want to call them that. So I think what's interesting is to see that a small community can respond more effectively in many cases than larger ones. One of the things that happened during the Spanish flu was there was a parade, I believe, in Pennsylvania, which was a huge super spreader, and people weren't prepared to protect themselves and so forth. I think the lessons of that are quite evident, and we are extremely aware of that as we move forward here in town just to touch base on that briefly, and we can discuss that a little bit further. But the Washington municipality has had, I think, a remarkable response to this. And in the first few months, we already had a volunteer corps prepared to assist people. We had a fund available to assist people and businesses, and that fund still exists. So that's the kind of thing that a small town can do when dealing with a crisis. I'm curious, how many people here, by a show of hands, were here when the polio vaccine was distributed in the schools? I mean, I was, yeah. Do any of you remember getting the first, I remember it being the first time was a shot, not the sugar cube or the oral. Do any of you remember getting a shot? Do any of you, would you like to talk about that? Anybody who raised your hands?
I don't recall personally getting a shot, but I lived in the Bronx, and I remember very clearly a young man, he was a teenager, and he was dating this young girl who had polio. And I've never seen anything like it before. They would literally, as teenagers, go on a date, and he would wheel her down the street in her iron lung.
Wow.
And it made a profound impression on me as one sign of, true teenage affection and love.
Yeah.
That's charming. Did anybody, was anybody in the grammar school in Washington remember getting their shots from the school nurse or the doctor at that time? Any of you? Well, I'll just briefly tell you, I was in grammar school at that time, and the school nurse's office was in the basement of what is now the administrative building on the campus of the Washington school. And I remember all of the classes were by class. We had to go down the stairs into the basement and stand in line. And I don't remember now, but I know the nurse was there, and I believe there was a doctor, and they administered a shot for the first polio vaccine. And then I believe later on, we were given an oral as well. Does anybody remember that sequence of events? Yeah, Keith. Keith's muted.
Yeah, Keith, you could unmute yourself on the lower left. There you go.
Yeah, I simply remember getting the sugar cube with the oral vaccine. I don't remember getting a shot for it.
Was that in the school system, Keith, or was that?
Yes, it was.
Here in Washington?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which year was it? You recall?
I'm not sure myself. I know I must have been, let's see, must have been, let's see, I would have been in first or second grade in 53, 52, 53.
I went to New Preston school then.
Oh, so you got.
I think it was still in New Preston, and Dr. Simons was there. He recognized knew all the little kids.
Yeah,
that's about all I remember of it.
Would have been Dr. Simons then.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else remember getting the vaccines of the flu? I mean, the sugar cube or the shot? Yeah, I don't know your name. You can unmute yourself.
My name is Pat, and I remember getting the sugar cube. I was very little, and I just remember standing in a line. It must have been at school. And it was outside of Philadelphia, I believe, where we were living at the time. So, but my parents had a big scare because I did have some symptoms before that happened. And I remember they were terrified that I had polio because I had a stiff neck and this and that. Well, it turns out I had appendicitis. Anyway, I very distinctly remember, I don't remember getting a shot, but I do remember that sugar cube.
And Trish, I saw you raise your hand at one point.
Well, I'm just chiming in from the Midwest. I was born in Wisconsin, and I remember getting sugar cubes, and I remember outside of school system sitting on the curb of my street and talking to my playmates across the street. I mean, you just couldn't, like now, you couldn't, but even more so as children, we could not engage with our friends whatsoever. It was a very long distance. Well, it was across the street, which seemed a long distance, but yeah, there was no intermingling, no playing. It was really a difficult time for children. It seemed to go on forever. I do remember a shot and also a sugar, then also standing in line for a sugar cube in Wisconsin, small town.
Yeah, I believe when the polio epidemic really started, I don't know if there were any victims here in town. I don't know, Stephen, if you have any record of that.
No, we haven't looked into that yet, but I do recall some stories of people, I think, who have told me that their families might have left the congregated sort of city areas like New York to come to Washington to sort of to try to escape that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're experiencing a similar thing now, and with good reason. I wouldn't want to be in a city in the middle of a pandemic either. But I have a vague recollection that for some reason, I know that swimming pools were closed, but of course, Washington didn't have any swimming pools. We had Lake Warramog, and I have a vague recollection of Lake Warramog being of us not being allowed to swim in Lake Warramog for at least one summer, if not more. Anybody else from town, Keith, or anybody else remember that, the lake being closed for swimming? No, okay. Well, of course, you couldn't swim in Lake Warramog in August generally because you would get pink eye, but that was a different problem. I think they've cleared that up, by the way. There's been some really good remediation done on the lake, and I think now that problem doesn't exist in the late summer.
But that's an interesting point, Dimitri, because I've heard, you know, when we've done our interviews with the older folks who live in town, a lot of them would prefer to swim at Mount Tom, I guess, because it was a much cleaner lake during that time.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's very true. Mount Tom was always considered a cleaner lake, cold, but clean. I mean, I remember I guess it was I don't know who taught it, but there were swimming lessons taught by the town. And you got in a bus or you were driven by your parents and you went to Mount Tom and they gave you swimming lessons. But it was at Mount Tom, it wasn't at the lake. Keith, did you get those swimming lessons?
I started, but then I got sick with something. I never finished it.
I never got to be a good swimmer either, but that's neither here. That's a different problem. I think I discovered flippers and snorkels, and I stayed underwater for most of my life. Anyway, I think the polio epidemic, in my recollection, and I'd like some of you to do what you can to remember that, but as Trish had pointed out, it was a really scary thing. And whether it was the idea that this thing could cripple you, you didn't know where it was, you didn't know who had it, very similar to the kind of thing we're experiencing now, but you did know of people that were victims of it. My own mother-in-law, ex-mother-in-law, deceased, had been a polio victim and had lost most of her upper arm functions, although she managed very well. And I think we all had some sense of the importance and danger of it. As the other gentleman had mentioned, the story of the teenager with the escorting his date in an iron lung. We'd all seen those images of children in iron lungs. We all participated in the March of Dimes, which was, I mean, I don't think the March of Dimes continues now, does it? Does anybody know? It does?
I think it continues. Maybe not as a physical event, but it certainly continues as a enterprise. I've seen it ongoing.
Yeah, it was a very active thing when I was a child. I mean, you were encouraged to contribute. Pete?
Dimitri, the March of Dimes does exist.
Mhm.
And I think that they have a broader agenda than just polio nowadays, but it does exist. And a friend of mine left the Red Cross about a year ago to become the chief financial officer of the March of Dimes. And so it definitely does exist.
Well, I think one of the things that, as we're facing the current situation, that we can be somewhat encouraged by with some caution is that polio largely doesn't exist any longer. And although there are parts of the world where the vaccine effort continues, where it's interfered with by various extremist groups, and which seems crazy, but it's true. But nonetheless, I think one of the things that we've been able to vanquish is polio, largely, and as we have smallpox, as we hope to be able to do with measles at some point if people stop pretending that they're going to be killed by the measles vaccine. And we're now looking forward to a situation where we may have a vaccine, although I wouldn't hold my breath, it's going to be a while before we see that. Other than polio and of course the Spanish influenza, I lost my great-grandfather or my grandfather to the Spanish influenza. I think there are other circumstances where this town has shown remarkable ability to resolve itself, and they're not all pandemics. Obviously, the flood of '55 was an enormous shock to the town of Washington. And I certainly remember as a child being here and remembering the town before the flood, remembering the town in its destroyed condition and then in its rebuilding, and as the town is now. Are there other people that were here during the flood of '55? Keith?
Yeah.
And
I lived in New Preston.
You lived in New Preston?
Yeah, and I think the first thing I remember about the flood was the sound of the rain coming down. It's like, never heard it that loud before. I actually thought the roof was on the house was gonna collapse. Then to look out back of the house to see the East Assapetuck River way higher than it had ever been before.
And you were in New Preston?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that, of course, those of you who are familiar with the Gunn's photographic libraries have probably seen pictures of the flood. Certainly, the flood has been a topic of a number of different seminars, conversations, meetings, all manner of things. And I don't want to beat it to death. Those of us who are familiar with that know, but it was basically a very simple event. There had been an enormous downpour, hurricane, and a series of rain for several days. And as Keith pointed out, the rain was horrendous. But what really caused the damage in the town of Washington, which had always flooded, by the way, historically, there'd always been high waters in the river and that had encroached on the town. But what happened was on Route 202 in Woodville, there had been an earthen roadway that had been built across the valley where the Chippewa River goes through. And the river went through culverts that were underneath that earthworks. The culverts jammed up, the water built up to the height of the road and eventually broke that earthworks, which was at least a few hundred feet high. And that surge of water came down over the high water river and came down through the center of town and basically took the whole depot out, including one house that had 2 residents that were killed, the Faloises. But that was the real cause of the damage, more so than the river rising, was this second surge that came down over the flooded river. The 55 flood was a huge disaster throughout Connecticut. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think one of the things that really is a remarkable thing, and that is that everybody, and I mean everybody, contributed to the work that was left afterwards. Not just the first responders who actually, one family shot an arrow and put a rope to a house and pulled a rope over, and then pulled their canoe or their rowboat over to the house to try to get people to leave. I think that was the Faloises, and they refused to leave. But there were other people who were saved by the rescue efforts. But after the flood had subsided, I don't remember anybody not being part of the volunteer process of cleaning up. Certainly, I remember my father having to get a tetanus shot. All the workers that worked in the mud, digging out the various buildings and streets and so forth. Everybody was working, and there are pictures, I think, of the at the time it was maybe the Women's Auxiliary that prepared meals for people. It was a remarkable effort, and I don't think of I can't imagine. I'm sure other towns did the same thing, but I witnessed that kind of effort, and it was an across the board thing. There was no nobody was left out. Everybody got into it and did what they could in whatever capacity they could. And it took quite a while, but we did rebuild the town. There's been some dissension about how it was rebuilt. Some people thought some of the rebuilding was inappropriate for the history of the town, but nonetheless, that was a remarkable effort. And does anybody remember their parents or themselves being part of that process? I remember the schools were closed, of course, but I guess not. I don't know if anybody remembers that effort by their parents or by themselves as teenagers or children. I think that the children weren't allowed to go into the depot for quite a while. Most of the families that had lived in the depot, their homes had been destroyed. And I'm sorry to see that I don't see anybody on the list here that were people who had homes that were along Beebrook Road. Of course, all the buildings in town at that time all had apartments on the second floors. Where families lived. Most of those buildings were, if not destroyed, were certainly uninhabitable for a while. Families had to be relocated temporarily. People took them into their homes and so forth. That's the kind of thing that is organized. And if you look at the history of the town, the volunteer effort to think how the community could be brought together, how it could be rebuilt, what aspects of the damage could be salvaged, what aspects of the damage couldn't be saved. Trisha's here, she's works at the Washington Art Association. The Washington Art Association, I believe, was a pharmacy on what is now River Road, but had been at that time Main Street. And all of what we now think of as River Road, on the left hand on the riverside, was buildings from the Hickory Stick, what was Parks Drugstore, all the way down to the bridge had been one building after another. All of those buildings were so badly damaged they had to be destroyed, except for the Art Association building, which was moved. There were other houses that were also moved. Yeah, Trish, go ahead.
I just wanted to relate a story. Going through the archives of the Art Association, I ran across a note by Joan Talbot, who was part of the Talbot family, Talbots were part of the original artists who started the Art Association. And Joan was writing to her colleagues at the time, and wondering how were they going to tell the artists who had work in the gallery that their work was now floating down the river. They just did not know how they were going to present that problem to the artists. And so wherever the art association was before it was it was also very much involved in that flooding. The history of what it became, the building it was and became, is kind of murky for me. But that story, I think, is iconic in the art association.
The original art association was basically in a building that was approximately where the driveway to Marty's is now, and there was an A&P which was then later rebuilt into the brick building where Marty's is now. But the Washington Art Association was a little tiny building attached to it. I think it might have at one point been the post office, but I'm not sure.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
There's a picture in the archive somewhere of a number of the artists and members of the association digging the muck out of the building. And somewhere in the archives there, Trish, is a picture of the show that was in that building
when the flood,
where the flood occurred. And then there's a picture of some people digging out the picture, the building. And of course, all the artwork just simply floated away. And I think that there were a couple of pieces that were found in Roxbury or someplace at one point. But the thing that makes the Art Association so emblematic of what the town did is if you look around the town, especially after the flood, you realize that every single business, including the Art Association, including the food markets, including the garages, all the businesses that were viable or wanted to continue to be viable were found, a location was found for them. And they were able to reestablish themselves as businesses in the community. So when the rebuilding began, it was there was a significant effort to make sure that everyone who had who was active in the town before had a chance and a space to regenerate their business in. The building where the Hickory Stick is now, I think, had 4 other businesses in it at one point. The building across from Marty's had 4 or 5 businesses in it. So in essence, there was this real effort by the organizers of the post-flood rebuild to ensure that everybody had some kind of location. And they also tried to relocate anybody who had been resident. So there was a lot of rebuilding going on for people's homes. Most of the homes along Bee Brook had, at one time, a lot of them had been on the riverside of Bee Brook and if they weren't so badly damaged, they were moved to the other side, or those homes were rebuilt on the other side of Bee Brook away from the river. So I think that speaks to a lot of what the town, the kind of effort that the town put into reclaiming itself as a community. And a lot of that was done by volunteers, an enormous effort. And it is the community we live in now as a result. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if there was federal funding for this. Was this all community-based efforts?
I think Stephen might know better than I, but I believe there was federal funding statewide.
Yeah, there was some federal funding, but I think one of the interesting things that I have heard through these interviews that we do is that insurance was not a common thing back then. So many of the homeowners and business owners here in Washington did not have insurance to help them rebuild. So it was a very difficult time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, again, one of the things that was interesting is that there were some very notable people in the community, wealthy people, in the community who were extraordinarily generous, both with their time and their influence, to make sure that Washington was rebuilt. There's been some grousing among some of the locals over time about Mr. Van Sinderen pushing an agenda through, but nonetheless, that effort was remarkable, and it did rebuild the community in a much more efficient way than many of the other communities in Connecticut that had been damaged by the flood never recovered properly. Yeah, Stephen.
Jean had a comment. I saw her hand there.
No, I think that it's significant, Dimitri, that you had mentioned that the Floyces were the two deaths during the flood. And Eileen Hearn, who was the granddaughter of those two people that died during the flood, her husband was the first person in town to die from COVID.
Yes, that's true. I believe we've only lost 2 or 3.
I think only 2, and one of them, I don't know whether it was directly related to COVID because he had a lot of underlying conditions that might have impacted his death, but I think that clearly the Hearn death was related to COVID, and the fact that it goes back to her losing her grandparents in the flood, I think is significant.
Yeah, it is. It is an irony that those 2 people, and it goes back to one of the things I commented on, and that was that the river always flooded. I mean, this was not something unexpected by people who lived in the depot or in town in general. Every year, the river flooded and came up out of its banks, and it was such a common thing that these people who had lived on the 2nd floor of this house, which was next to what the 3-story white building, which we call Parks. It was on the riverside of that building. It always got flooded, and the river. There's dozens of pictures of the town with water over its banks. So they just thought, it's just another flood. It's just another winter. I mean, summer, spring flood or whatever. Summer flood in that case. But of course, they didn't know about what was happening in Woodville, and nobody in town expected this incredible surge of water coming up over the high water of the river to begin with. And that's what really did the damage, and literally took the Floyce house and floated it down the river. I think Billy Bader was living at his home, which was high up on the hill above River Road. And he saw the house float by when he was looking out and saw it going down the river. But I think, you know, we do a very interesting thing. We always recognize the people who have contributed to this town. I mean, we do it with our Memorial Day, and we do it in other ways as well. And we don't necessarily think about, we think about it in terms of deaths, but we don't necessarily think about it in terms of lives. And families that have been here in town that had, for example, during the flood, anybody who had a truck or a tractor or a bulldozer or was in the construction business, there wasn't any conversation about, they just went to work and started to do things to rebuild. And certainly, you know, the Kahlers and the Wyants and other contractors that lived in the area were extremely instrumental in helping to rebuild the town. And in many cases, not with a great profit incentive either. And I think that's an important thing to realize in terms of the way the town responds to things. There's an interesting, I don't want to, anybody else have anything about the flood that they want to talk about? No?
I just have a question about the gunnery. Were any of those people who are probably more wealthy than the townsfolk, the folks at the gunnery, the student, did they help in any way? Were they affected by this flood?
Well, first of all, the flood happened in August. So the gunnery wasn't actually in residence at the time in terms of its student population. And I'm not sure to what extent the faculty, although in those days, most of the faculty of the gunnery was very close in residence to the campus itself. So I'm not sure if the student body was probably not much involved, other than the fact that there may have been, and I don't know, there may have been a delay. The campus was largely untouched by the water, certainly. And by the time school had started, certainly access to the campus. I'm not sure what Rumsey suffered. I don't know if anybody knows. The flood would have perhaps damaged some of Rumsey because they're still on the Chippewa and Bantam rivers. But certainly the grammar school and high school, New Preston had its own grammar school in those days, which was up on the hill above the town. And I don't believe it was damaged. But certainly the depot schools were useless. I mean, they were completely flooded out. And the students for that school, we, on one part of town, we went to school for quite a while at the parish house on the green. I think other kids that were from the other side of town probably ended up at New Preston. Some of them probably, there may have even been a second set of classrooms in the town hall, which had been spared from the high wall. I don't really know if anybody knows directly more about that. But certainly, similar to what we're going through now, all of the children were affected by the disruption of that flood. And it was a good year or more before our school system was returned to functioning. There was no regional school at that time. So it was all basically Washington Grammar School. Roxbury had its own grammar school, as it still does. And then Roxbury and New Preston kids came to the Washington High School in 7th and 8th grade, and I think New Preston in 6th grade. But it wasn't a regional system. And that was definitely a disruption to the educational process, but somehow we managed to learn something because here I am. And
Dimitri, I just wanted to add something about Trish's question about the gunnery's involvement in the flood of 1955. Here at the museum, we have a brief film about the aftermath of the flood. And I know that the gunnery headmaster, Hamilton Gibson, speaks on that recording. And that was, I think, the grandfather of our late friend, Paula Krimsky. And he was instrumental in the reconstruction committee. So that's one of the ways that I know that the gunnery was involved in the flood of 55.
Yeah, I think we forget very often that the town it is in many ways, it's, other than being a lovely place to live, is an educational community. I mean, there are not a lot of small towns with 3,000 populations or such that have 5 educational facilities in their town. I mean, that's kind of unbelievable. So education has always been a pretty significant part of Washington, and those institutions have always contributed to the town and volunteered to assist in the town. I mean, gunnery used to do nature walks and do various brush cleanings and things like that around town, so forth. So I'd like to move on to another event that happened a little bit more in the recent past, and that was the October blizzard that we had. I don't remember now, how many years ago was that? 10, 12 years ago? Where how many people were here for that? Anybody? Yeah, okay, now we're on it.
Was it that storm that was like 10 days long?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, got it.
Yeah. Okay, so the October blizzard was devastating for one significant reason, and that is that the trees all had leaves on them. So when that heavy snow hit those trees, I know for myself, I could stand outside my house and I could hear branches raining down out of the trees. I mean, just cracking and falling and cracking and falling. It was remarkable. And literally the town was completely isolated and shut down for a day or a few days. And then we were without power in many cases for 6 or 7 days, if I'm not mistaken, in some places longer. And again, similar to the flood, the town immediately organized its volunteership, and people were housed at the town hall where if they had no heat, there were cots set up. There was food service. You could pick up MRI meals if you needed to. And I'll tell one little anecdotal story. At the time, my mother-in-law was living in the apartment in my house, and she was an elderly lady. And as I'd mentioned, had been a polio survivor. So she needed assistance in many ways, but she was capable of taking care of herself. And I, of course, lived in the house as well. In any case, we'd had this snowstorm, and of course, everything was gone. And I had been able to get, somehow somebody had come through, and I don't really even know how that happened, but somebody came through and plowed out my driveway. So there was technically a way to get in and out. So I got out and I came back to my home to find the Washington emergency truck in the middle of my neighbor's lawn. And Jimmy Britton was standing there, and I said, Jimmy, what are you doing? And why is your truck in the middle of the lawn? He said, well, I was coming up to give your mother-in-law some soup because we didn't know if she was okay. And we thought we'd better check on her. And I said, okay. I said, well, why is the truck in the lawn? And he goes, well, I didn't know where the road was, and I kind of slipped off. And I said, okay. And he said, well, Titus is coming up with the tow truck because the truck was full of water. It was the water truck tanker. So we had to, they were emptying out the tank, and then Titus was going to hold him. Meanwhile, Jimmy takes the takeout meal up to the house to give it to Jean while he's waiting for the tow truck. Okay, and of course she was very polite about it, but she was fine because we had a gas stove, 2, we had a generator running for a few hours a day. We were looking after her, she was okay. But it says something about that kind of effort that the community puts forward. And, you know, yeah, Titus came and pulled the truck out, and Jimmy went on about delivering food to other people around town. But I didn't ask for the help. Jean hadn't asked for the help. They just knew that there were elderly people that needed looking after. And that's, I think, a credit to the kind of community that we live in and how it responds to things. I'm sure other people may have stories of that. Anybody remember being at the town hall to get food, or did anybody stay down there? No? Oh, Jean.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't in town when the storm happened because I was in Vermont burying my mother. And I came home to the devastation that was here. But I think about what you were just saying about Jim Britton and bringing things unsolicited to the house. And it has nothing to do with crisis, but it's kind of funny. The year that I moved into my home, 1974 on Rabbit Hill, Jerry Martin delivered my mail, and I hadn't told the post office we were moving.
Yeah.
Not crisis, but a funny kind of people coming through in town just because it's a small town and everyone knows everything.
Well, and to that point, I mean, I have actually gotten letters addressed to Dimitri Washington. You know, but I think, and to that point, and I think when I was growing up, my father was an artist, and that's not a particularly lucrative employment. So there were many times when things were a little thin. And I can remember a few times where the supply company at that point was the oil delivery company. Somebody had paid for a tank of oil to be delivered, and we never knew who. Or we found a pile of wood dumped on the side of the house, firewood, and we never knew who had done that. And I think that kind of thing goes on in town quietly, without a lot of fanfare, with no credit being sought or even acknowledged. I think that's the kind of thing that goes on. And certainly that October snowstorm was a good example of people getting, I mean, everybody was out with a chainsaw if they had one. Nobody waited for somebody to ask them if they could cut the tree down or clear the road. Of course, if there were power lines down, people were careful, but by and large, that kind of effort continues. And even in the most recent little windstorm that we had a few months ago, or whenever it was, the same thing. You saw people out clearing the roads, helping the town crew, checking on people to see if they were okay. That's the kind of thing that you don't necessarily understand about living in a community until you've had that experience. Yeah, Matilda?
When that snowstorm hit, there were students across the street at the Swiss Hospitality Institute, and they were out sledding down the road, down Wickham.
Yeah.
And they saw me shoveling, and they all came over and shoveled my whole driveway.
Nice.
Yeah, good.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and that's, I think, the kind of thing that we see moments of, and I think it hardens all of us. I know, for example, in the last windstorm, there were a number of people who I'm in the middle of painting a house, and a tree had come down, luckily didn't destroy the house, but came close to it. I was concerned. There was an elderly lady living in the house, but yeah, the town crew had come by, other people had come by to check on her, to check on the situation. Of course, there was no power, but it wasn't, nobody had asked for that to be done. It was just done. And I think that's something that we're experiencing right now in the community. There are a number of people that have been assisted in one way or another, very quietly and anonymously. To that end, the community does offer assistance and support to people that are in the midst of this crisis and who need help either confidentially or simply because they're being stuck in a difficult situation that has no easy resolution. And the town has marshaled its efforts to support that. And I think we've been very fortunate. We lost one restaurant, but look at the response. Those of you who've lived in town, look at how the various restaurants, for example, have tried to make sure that people had access to takeout food. There were people who contributed to food, dinners. I think the GW did this a number of times where somebody had paid for dozens and dozens of meals for first responders and health workers to simply go to the GW and pick up a meal for 2 or 3 people. And that had been paid for by somebody. And the fund that exists in the town now to assist people has existed since, I think, February, certainly since March. And that fund continues to be available to people who are in need. And the municipality continues to provide support. I can give you, if anybody's interested, I can tell you a few of the things that the town is doing, if anybody's interested in that. We're constantly in touch with all the schools to find out how they're managing the students and the educational process. We're in touch with all the businesses on a regular basis. There are people from the Business Association that participate in the COVID committee to discuss issues with the town. The town has been able to provide masks and other safety precautions for people in town. Yeah.
Mary Ann has thermometers. You need them.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is, again, an example of how a community, a small community can marshal its efforts. And there has been outreach to elderly and isolated people. I think that's an ongoing process through the senior center and through other volunteers. And of course, through the citizenry itself. I mean, we all know people that are isolated and check in on them and so forth and so on. We're now facing a surge in the epidemic, and we've been very fortunate to have a very low incidence of infection. And that's, again, an example of the way the community responds to things. Basically, you walk around town, and if you're in a business or in a public street, the citizens are masked and maintaining polite distance and being considerate to each other. And certainly a credit goes out to all the businesses. The food market has done remarkably well to continue to provide a safe place for food. Yeah. Trish.
I know that this is on the mundane level, but the town of Washington has arranged for the senior center now to be open for public bathrooms from 9 to 5 every day. I think maybe on Sunday, not so long, but 9 to 5, so that we have visitors who come and they can have a bathroom. And one only wonders how things are going to be played out when Thanksgiving and how the community is going to step up for Thanksgiving.
Well, I know that there is going to be a COVID-safe Holiday in the Depot event. It's going to be largely a drive-through kind of situation where people will be able to drive up to various businesses, and there's going to be outdoor tents and so forth. There's going to be some kind of Santa Claus thing for children, and they'll be able to drive by and visit with Santa Claus. We were going to do a more pedestrian form of Holiday in the Depot with people walking around town. But as the surge started to build up, we realized that could be dangerous. So we've now scaled it into a sort of a drive-through kind of thing. Also, I think there's going to be people who are going to be decorating their homes. There's going to be a map available, and you'll be able to drive around and see various homes that are decorated. We're trying to maintain some kind of sense of civic activity so that obviously you look around, and we're going to try and maintain a sense of community. We have a very large new population, and I mean, I don't know the exact statistics right now, but basically the town of Washington is at its summer high residential population, if not a little bit more so. There are no houses for rent. New houses have been bought, new people have moved in, and they have put their children in the schools. That means that they're here for at least the duration. That means that they've become part of the community in a way that is quite heartening. I mean, they're not just flying through. They're not just refugeeing from the COVID. They're actually investing in the community, and they're investing by putting their children in the schools, by buying property that they're going to be living in. And that new population is being exposed to the kind of welcoming and activity that the town has been known for. And we've done that for generations now in this town. There have been many waves of people coming into this community and establishing themselves. As far back as the early Swedish migration into the town, certainly the turn of the century migration of summer homes that became prominent residencies, and people who contributed to the town. That goes on, and we welcome them. And we're especially pleased that they brought their children. What could be more encouraging than new? I think we have upwards of 60 new children in the school system in Washington alone. That's very encouraging. Are we getting close to time here? We are.
We are.
Well, listen, folks, I spend most of the time talking. I'm sorry, but it's an odd environment to try to create conversation in. We're used to being able to sit around in the library and just go off on each other, but I'm encouraged that we're able to do this at all. I appreciate all of you participating. If you have any other ideas or thoughts that you would like to contribute, I'm sure Stephen will take notes. And we look forward to doing this again. What's our next objective? Do we have one? Agenda?
Yeah. So Dimitri is going to be back with us in February, and
because I can't go anywhere.
We're going to be talking about Washington winters, past and present.
Yeah, well, let's hope we're not all out of power. I'm running on a generator right now myself. Okay, Old North Road blew a transformer about 3 hours ago, and for the second time in 2 days. So yeah, welcome to the country, folks. Stay well and safe. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you again. Those of you who are here, stay well and safe.
Bye, Dimitri and everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.